All right, welcome everyone to this live edition of Raise the Roof. So we're looking today at the 1925 Scopes monkey trial, which turned a small Tennessee courtroom into a national showdown between the Bible and Darwin. At least that's how we see it today. 100 years later, though, that clash of worldviews still shapes our laws, our schools, and our culture, and how it misrepresents Christianity. So in just a moment, I'll be joined by my friends Casey Luskin and Rick Townsend, who will help us figure out the parts, unpack all of these issues, and how parents, students, teachers, philosophers, historians, or scientists can navigate the turbulent waters of human origins through the lens of the Christian worldview. So before I bring in the guys, though, let me just set the stage for why this conversation matters. So just last week, I spoke with a young woman after class where I teach. She's a freshman, a biology major who grew up with a young earth creationist background. And that's how she understood the Bible. Now she's struggling to reconcile what she's learning in science with her trust in scripture. What she doesn't realize, and what we talked a little bit about, is that for the most of church history, there was no real conflict between the pursuit of knowledge through observations of the natural world and the pursuit of knowledge through reading the Bible. Augustine, for example, writing in the 4th century, said that some people read books in order to find God, but the very appearance of God's creation is a great book. He urged believers to, quote, ponder heaven and earth religiously. Centuries later, in the 1000s, Hugh of St. Victor echoed Augustine's call to harmony, writing that the whole sensible world is like a kind book written by the finger of God. Each creature is a figure instituted by divine will to manifest the inevitable things of God's wisdom. So in short, the conviction that God reveals himself both in scripture and in nature is the very thing that inspired the birth of modern science. Yet today, due in no small part to things like the Scopes trial, many of the freshmen in my Christian worldview course struggle to believe these two books can speak together because they've been taught there is an unbridgeable divide between science and faith, especially when it comes to human origins. And the numbers really bear that out. 80% of US adults believe humans evolved from lower animals, lower hominids over time. And this, of course, shapes the way we're going to read our scripture, or when we push back on that, if special creation, that's going to create some potential conflict. So with that backdrop in mind, let me welcome Casey and Rick into the conversation. I'm so glad you guys are here to help navigate the history and legacy of the Scopes trial. There has been a lot of bad stories about this. There's been a lot of bad podcasts on this 100th anniversary. There's been a lot of bad articles. And you guys bring a little bit of expertise and uniqueness to this topic that I think is a good match, good synergy for what we're going to look at here. So, Casey, let me start with you. I brought you in because you've got a good background in the law. You've also, obviously this being a legal case, that's important, but you've got a good science background. You've dealt with this issue of intelligent design, which has some crossover here in more recent court cases, not in the original Scopes trial, but there's a lot of crossover in how the law deals with these issues. So your expertise in this and unique qualifications are really important. So introduce yourself, what you do, and why this case really matters to you. Why'd you bother to agree to do the show with me?
Oh, well, thank you so much, Joe, for having me. It's great to be on with you and Rick. You guys are both longtime friends and people who are very knowledgeable about this subject. Rick, I don't know if I know anybody who knows as much about Scopes as you do, so I appreciate being able to be on with you guys. Yeah, so as you said, I have a PhD in geology from the University of Johannesburg and also earth sciences degrees from UC San Diego, but my original plan in life was actually to become an attorney, and I am an attorney. I have a law degree from the University of San Diego. I've been a California licensed attorney since 2005. In fact, this month is the 20th anniversary of me passing the bar exam, or learning that I passed the bar exam. So it's been 20 years now. Hard to believe it. Time goes by very fast. But what's interesting is that my exclusive area, almost exclusive area of legal practice has been in the teaching of origins in public schools. And I mean, I'm certainly not the world's greatest attorney. Okay. I'm not going to for a moment pretend to be, the most experienced attorney. I don't think I've ever actually filed a brief with a court. That's sort of acknowledges my lack of legal experience in that respect. However, when
Casey,
it comes
Casey, in fairness, but in fairness though, some might argue there's no such thing as a good attorney. So yeah,
fair,
just to
fair enough. So maybe
clarify
it's
that
good.
point.
Maybe it's good to not be a really
That's just
experienced
mean.
attorney. But the reality is my exclusive area of practice, and I do have a ton of experience in this, has been advising teachers and educators and legislators on how to teach this issue of evolution, intelligent design, and origins in public schools. And I've been doing that now for about 20 years. Also, lots of experience dealing with academic freedom cases. I have advised many clients and worked on many cases where scientists have been persecuted because of their views on intelligent design. Also, I've published a lot in the technical legal literature. I've written about 7 law review articles in various legal journals, including Journal of Church and State, Montana University Law Review, Hamline University Law Review. I would like to think I wrote kind of the definitive law review on sort of an extensive review of the case law of teaching the topic of origins in public schools. Also co-authored the book Traipsing into Evolution, which is a response to the Dover ruling. In fact, my first assignment at Discovery Institute when I first started there, this was in September of 2005, was to go and watch the Dover trial in person. I sat through about a third of the Dover trial in person. So this has been an issue that I've really cared passionately about as far as the law goes for many years. This year, it being the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial, did a lot of media related to that. I got interviewed by World Magazine for their podcast, interviewed by NPR when they covered the Scopes trial back in July. And I had op-eds published in the Daily Wire, Salvo Magazine, Science and Culture Today, and even an op-ed in July this year in the New York Post that talked a little bit about the Scopes trial. And I've got a scholarly article under review right now, or actually, I'm sorry, it's in press right now at the journal Theology and Science, titled Scopes in Reverse, Reflections on Academic Freedom and Intelligent Design. So done a lot of stuff on this issue. I don't talk about the legal side that much these days. I'm more focused on the science, but it's a lot of fun to be here with you guys, Joe.
Yeah, Casey, that's awesome, man. And I know that background is going to be so helpful. And for folks listening, watching live, I put up a little comment there. We got some Keller, Texas. Welcome to the show on our YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, all those places we're broadcasting live on X as well. But one of the things, Casey, that's important about this is that I'll link to the NPR, several of those articles you mentioned. A lot of that will be in the show notes for folks after when we listen to the podcast version. So people can get access to those things later on for sure if they want to read more details. So that brings us to you, my friend Rick. Tell us a little bit about your background. Why did you agree to come on today? What's your connection to this history and how it relates to the church today?
Well, thanks, Joe. It's really great to be here, and I appreciate you including me with Casey. My professional bio related to this is shorter, but passionate. So I grew up in Nebraska and knew next to nothing about William Jennings Bryan. In fact, my first published article after my PhD a couple of years ago was on why I didn't know anything about William Jennings Bryan, and it's because the Scopes trial, sorry, the play and movie Inherit the Wind so discolored Bryan's reputation that they weren't teaching anything about him when I grew up in his home state. So anyway, my professional career is Air Force fighter pilot and then airline pilot, but I've always been passionate about history and evidence for the Christian faith. And so pursued a PhD in history of ideas, which is the intersection of culture and concepts. So the big ideas and how culture shapes those ideas and vice versa, how the ideas shape the culture. And so I was able to do a dissertation on William Jennings Bryan and his use of rights in his advocacy for various causes through the 30 plus year career that he was involved in national politics. So that's been my entry into this, and I did a lot of research on the Scopes trial from a cultural standpoint more than a legal standpoint. So hopefully between Casey and I, we can kind of broaden that. And speaking of anniversaries, I just had a 50th anniversary of my graduation from the Air Force Academy, but it was also this
Wow.
year was the 100th anniversary of Scopes. And so I went to a history symposium in Dayton, Tennessee, which, by the way, had only one side presented. There were other commemorative events that had the other side presented. It's interesting that we still, 100 years later, are not talking about both sides in the same context very often.
That's
Rick,
awesome.
you're such
There's
a humble guy, Rick. You got to mention one thing about your bio, that you are a former Air Force fighter pilot, which I think is like the coolest thing ever. I'll say it for you if you won't, but
I ran by it briefly. I've flown everything from F-15s to Boeing 777s, so 777. So a lot of varied aviation experience, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about today.
Yeah, well, that's all right. I'll give you guys. There's some little confetti celebrating your 50th there for you, my friend.
Thanks.
Okay.
Just means I'm really old.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, it is really good to have you connect with this on this topic, and especially because there's so many different disciplines, and none of us, even though we can study across disciplines, can be experts in all these things. So I think we'll do some really good work here today to help people understand the importance of this event historically, but where it comes down today. So with that, let's jump into a little historical background, what really happened in Dayton in 1925. So I read that NPR article, Casey, that you mentioned, and it was really interesting to hear your side of it and then the other side of all the back and forth that the authors put together for that. And the authors of that write, although controversial, Darwin's theory, first published in 1859, steadily gained acceptance among scientists, even as it drew growing opposition from religious conservatives. By the 1920s, the rise of religious fundamentalism and biblical literalism among evangelical Protestant groups was reshaping America's religious landscape, setting it on a collision course with modern scientific thought. That shift helped lead to Tennessee's Butler Act, passed in 1925, which banned the teaching of evolution in the state's public schools and universities. So that's what the article frames, and I think even there you see this sort of bias. There's a little bit of there's a lot of biased framing in what is actually at odds. There's again the science versus fundamentalist religious interpretation, which isn't fully correct. Yes, those things did exist, but it was also differences of science, which they're not going to lean into. But the law itself, though, just to focus in on that for a second, included the following statement, which seems to reinforce the science versus religious narrative. And this is why I wanted to quote this part of it. Here's what it says, quote, "Be it enacted by the General Assembly of the State of Tennessee that it shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals, and all other public schools of the state which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals." So let me add, this article does connect with a lot of a newsreel of the History Channel, which includes original footage from this 1925 trial. And this helps in the framing. So with that article in mind, let me show this clip really quick for folks, and then I'm going to kick it to both of you guys to see what you think about this framing and what we should take from this. So here's the newsreel as well.
John Scopes, a young teacher of Tennessee, had taught, contrary to state law, Darwin's theory of evolution. The Tennessee country people believed this was contrary to biblical doctrine. And Scopes' trial got worldwide publicity, with the Tennessee fundamentalists lined up against the liberals and intellectuals of America. William Jennings Bryan, old and full of oratory, defended the beliefs of the fundamentalists. He was aided by the prosecuting zeal of old Judge Ben McKenzie, a local politician influential in the area, who helped to make the trial an inquisition. The courtroom was packed as the case reached a climax. Arthur Garfield Hayes, defending Scopes, explained Darwin's theory of evolution, and Dudley Field Malone, another liberal, added his plea for tolerance to the cause of freedom of thought. Then the defense threw in another artful veteran, Clarence Darrow, for what turned out to be the cross-examination of Bryan. Darrow, in a shirt-sleeves analysis, reduced the elder statesman's antiquated ideas to intellectual rubble.
After the closing remarks, Judge Ralston charged the jury, and they retired for their deliberations on a verdict. On the day of the announced decision, the two opposing sides waited calmly in the courtroom. The jury foreman, Captain Jack Thompson, delivered the verdict of guilty as charged. John Scopes received the decree of his $100 fine without any outward show of bitterness. 2 years later, the decision was to be reversed in the Appellate Court of Appeals. William Jennings Bryan died 5 days after the end of the famous trial. Also Although victorious in the courtroom, he and the fundamentalist cause had been destroyed. The encounter in Dayton, Tennessee, had solved the basic struggle of thinking and education in the modern day world.
Okay, so there's our framing between. So was it? I mean, it looks like the law kind of tends to reinforce that idea. This is a battle of biblical fundamentalism versus science. Is that the right framing? Is that the only framing? What do you guys say?
There's so much wrong with that clip.
Well, pick out your favorites.
There's so many. Just real quick, I took a few notes on it. Brian was not the lead prosecutor. Darrow did not. He was not inserted by anyone. He pushed his way into the trial immediately when Brian was part of it. The idea that there was any intellectual rubble left, it just overstates things so dramatically that it's comical in retrospect. If you know anything about at all about the real Scopes trial, the framing is such a parody that it's worse than Inherit the Wind, really.
What are some of the details? So fill in, just give a couple examples of what we might want to see. Because you mentioned that he inserted himself, he wasn't called. What are some of those details that really kind of matter for the way we reinterpret this, that distort our perception of especially the Bible and science? What are some of those key details of the trial that you might want to throw in there?
Well, culturally, the Bible and the details of evolution really were not part of the case. The case was about whether it was legal to teach a particular part of the curriculum, and it had Darrow wanted it to be about evolution versus creation. So did Brian, interestingly enough. But Brian was not in charge of the prosecution. He was their lead draw, their public figure, but he didn't even speak in the trial substantively for days until there
Mm.
was an opportunity for him to make a point. So the idea that it's settled anything and left intellectual rubble behind on the side of the anti-evolution argument is simply wrong.
Wow,
I
interesting.
mean,
Casey.
legally, Casey can
Oh,
speak to this better than me, but there was no verdict. It was a directed verdict because they changed. Darrow convinced his client to change his plea to guilty, and then directed the jury to say he's guilty. And so it was a directed verdict. It was not really a plea that was not guilty, and then they came back and said guilty. They were directed to find him guilty, and they did. And Darrow did that so he could bring the case up on appeal. But now I'm treading onto Casey's legal
yeah.
ground. So
No, that's good.
No, you
Casey, frame it. Help us understand.
No, Rick, you may know the details of exactly how the trial was resolved better than I do. But I mean, just as far as the framing of that clip goes, I love the ominous, or maybe I don't love, but the ominous music. It
Dun,
says
dun,
with
dun.
the Tennessee fundamentalists against the liberals and intellectuals, says the
right.
trial was like an inquisition, and it reduced the antiquated statesman's ideas to intellectual rubble. And of course, as Scopes is being burned at the stake, he was not bitter, it says. So I mean, the glorious the glorious Scopes. But I mean, the reality is, and Rick, you know all about this as well, is that the idea that when Darrow cross-examined Brian on the witness stand, which was very unusual to put one of the attorneys on the witness stand, but the idea that Brian's ideas were reduced to intellectual rubble is just not true. I mean, we've all probably heard this
Yeah.
story, but maybe some of the listeners have not. William Jennings Bryan was not some kind of a hard line young Earth creationist who believed that the Earth was 6,000 years old and his ideas were not ripped to shred. He was actually an old Earth believer in the Bible who, that was his view. And so when he was put on the witness stand, he articulated his views. There was no, ripping of the book of Genesis to shreds. And Brian just simply stated his view that you can interpret the book of Genesis through an old Earth lens. These were views, the day age theory, the gap theory. These were ideas that had been around for quite a long time and had been talked about in evangelical circles. And this was Brian's views. And even Stephen Jay Gould recognizes, when he talked about this trial, that Brian was not humiliated on the witness stand, and he was just stating his own
Right.
view. And it's sort of been a retelling of history that, a fake history, I guess you could say, that somehow Brian somehow admitted that the days of creation might have been more than 24 hours. No, that was just his view.
It probably was his idea, but he never really talked about that before. He had moved largely from politics to evangelist by this point in his career. and he was advocating moral causes. He switched to suffrage and women's right to vote, but also this issue on evolution. He was opposed to evolution based on, it's kind of a longer story, but what had happened in World War One and people's taking of Darwinian principles and treating other humans badly because they believed they were superior. So Brian's views really switched on how important that issue was after World War One. So by this point, he had become mostly an evangelist. He was sharing the gospel. He was doing, stump speeches that were more evangelical than political. And so he didn't talk, as I've read his stuff, I've never read him mention anything about his age of the universe type ideas until the trial. And it surprised Darrow that he actually came out with these positions and kind of took him back a little bit. So the
Yeah.
idea that these were shocking, I think Brian had probably a fairly shallow theology in some respects because he was focused on the gospel and not on some of these other issues that Darrow wanted to embarrass him with.
Okay, so I still want to talk about a little bit of the framing of the trial, the cultural impact, the role the ACLU played a little bit. But since we're on the two principal lawyers, at least the one that gets all the press, uh, I want to look at the sense of their key arguments, the ideas that they wanted to present. Before we do that, I gotta have a little bit of fun thing here. So folks have to know one of the reasons we do this, is a lot of misinformation about this trial. There is a lot of intentionally distorting of some events, and some of it's just the cultural distortion that happens because of popular movies. We'll cover Inherit the Wind, other framings that happen that just sort of take on this. So let's talk about the lawyers. Let's talk about their names. But first, well, here's a little clip. Joshua Swamidas was on with James Tour talking about this because he'd written an article. And I kind of have sympathy for Josh in this sense. I used to, years ago, before I even studied it, I thought the lawyer's name was William Jennings Bryant, like the T. And I probably misspelled that a million times because just not hearing how people pronounced it or not seeing it written and hearing dialogue. But here's Josh struggling with those names just for fun.
Williams Jennings Bryan. Williams Jennings Bryan but unlike Donald Trump, Williams Jennings Bryan was incredibly popular. Williams Jennings Bryan was a majoritarian populist, and recognizing that they're going to be arguing against Williams Jennings Bryan, they invited a guy named Charles Darrow, so Charles Darrow ends up being on the side of the defense, and then Williams Jennings Bryan being on the prosecution. In the very last minute, Charles Darrow, are you okay with me trying to call Williams Jennings Bryan to the stand?
Okay, so maybe his good friends called him Charles. I don't know, but each of you guys give me the correct pronunciation of each guy's name, and just tell me a little bit again. What was their main argument? What was their main idea? We touched a little bit on some of their background, but just set the stage for each guy a little bit. I don't know who wants to jump in. Casey, you want to start on that, or maybe Rick, this is your wheelhouse. Not sure.
I think it's more
Well,
Rick's wheelhouse. Go ahead, Rick.
That's what I was thinking too, because his
well,
PhD was on a lot of this stuff. So
William Jennings Bryan was a believing Christian. He strongly believed the biblical principles. But it's interesting. You opened the show, Joe, with this idea that students being drawn away by evolution was a problem, and that was what actually got Bryan first interested in evolution. Was he was receiving letters from constituents who were saying their kids were going off to college and coming back, going away as Christians and coming back as unbelievers based on the scientific content that they were being exposed to. And so that's what started him down that political career path. Clarence Darrow was
not
a
Charles.
notorious but extremely gifted attorney. He took on all kinds of controversial cases. Usually took cases where the guilty party, the alleged guilty party, was very rich, and so he could get fairly well paid. And then very occasionally he would take a pro bono case where he felt that the client was not going to get a fair trial. So he legitimately did care about people getting a fair trial. Took several cases we won't go into right now, but he did take some cases in that regard. He claimed later that this was the only case he had ever volunteered for, the Scopes trial. The only place he'd ever volunteered his legal services free of charge. So in other cases, he had been asked to defend somebody and did, but he pushed his way into this one and did it free of charge. But he had
Mm.
just defended two thrill killer teenagers, Leopold and Loeb, who had killed another younger teenager to prove how smart they were. And of course, they weren't that smart, got caught
Oh yeah.
quickly. And he used a very novel defense based on Nietzschean philosophy that they didn't understand that they had responsibilities to act in a moral way because of their teaching. So he blamed their teaching, got them off the death penalty. But this was just the year before Scope. So at this point, the country is kind of up in arms against Clarence Darrow for getting these guys off for a brutal murder that they clearly should have deserved maximum penalty for. So that's Clarence Darrow. He's in the national spotlight for defending people who bombed newspaper offices, killed people. You know, he would take the worst of the worst cases and give them the best defense he could. And so he was a materialist, naturalist, would have been considered today a methodological naturalist. And so he was always on the side of Darwin and evolution and pushing that
Mm.
narrative.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that does bring to light the framing of the whole trial itself. The broadcast was it's like $1,000 a day to broadcast this courtroom, and they really
Yeah, first
rearranged the
live radio
entire.
broadcast ever.
Yeah, and they arranged the whole courtroom to accommodate the microphones. So this was a unique an event. And when we'll go back to Swami Das here, because he was on with William Lane Craig, and they were talking about this, and he made this comparison to the O.J. Simpson trial, which again, I think, if we're trying to understand this thing 100 years ago and to make a modern analog, to my mind, I'm no expert in, everyone like everyone else saw OJ's trial, but I was no expert in this compared to you guys. But it seems like a fairly decent comparison. Here, let me share that clip, and then I'm going to get your comparison. Does this help? Does it hurt? What's the real historical framing of this? And I guess part of it too is I want to find out because I read an article this week, one of the news articles that talked about how the entire trial was a setup, that it was really not even a real situation, that the entire thing was set up just for this purpose. And I don't know if that's true or not. That's just a claim I read. So I'm curious to see what you think of
Yeah.
the trial, how that frames. So here's the clip.
You mentioned the O.J. Simpson trial, and that's a good comparison in some important ways. So the O.J. Simpson trial was in the 90s. That was the first trial that was televised live across the country, and it had a huge cultural impact. Even though the legal questions being addressed weren't really that pressing, it became like a topic of, a shared experience that we all had of just looking at this trial, thinking about it, trying to understand how this impacted how we think about a whole bunch of big cultural issues. The same thing similar was going on with the Scopes trial. In a similar way, it was really the first trial ever that was broadcast live by radio every single step of the way through for the entire week and a half that it happened.
Okay. Who was it? Rick, let's start with you a little bit on the framing, because I think that's definitely yours. And then, Casey, I know you have some thoughts on this as well. So let's start with you first, Rick.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that he compares, and we frequently have this question of what is the trial of the century, and O.J. Simpson frequently comes up. That was like a celebrity trial. What made that notorious or interesting, I suppose, to the masses was its appeal to this incredibly popular figure, O.J. Simpson, who it seems all the evidence pointed to the fact that he had done a really brutal murder. But as Swamidass correctly says, it had no legal precedent. The difference in the Scopes trial is that 100 years later, we're still talking about the same issues. We may get to this later, but there are Supreme Court cases today addressing who controls education. Is it the parents? Is it the educators? And that battle is still going on. So that the issues that were framed in the trial itself were the basic issues of who controls education, and that's what makes it still noteworthy a century later.
Mm-hmm. Casey, what do you think? What's our best framing for this?
Yeah, so I mean, point of information there. Of course, we can forgive Swami Das for mispronouncing names. We've all done that before. Who hasn't mispronounced a name? Let that person cast the first stone. But
I will
it's
probably
actually
do it
not
this show.
we'll probably do the same thing. But it's and it's another little, small item. But this OJ trial was not the first trial that was televised across the country, contra what Swamidas says. I looked into this. The 1991 Pamela Smart trial was the first trial that was televised around the United States. And I remember when the OJ trial came out in 1995 because I was just starting my senior year of high school. And the day that the verdict came out, a couple of friends and I already had plans to go to a Dodger game, and we brought a sign to the game that said the juice is loose. And we held the sign up at the Dodger game, and it got taken away from us. So a little memory there. That was in the fall of 1995, and good times there. But I actually disagree with you, Rick, on one thing. We will still be talking about the OJ trial in 100 years. And do you know why?
Well, true.
Because without the OJ trial, we wouldn't have had Robert Shapiro. And without Robert Shapiro, we wouldn't have Kim Kardashian, okay? So it's directly because of the OJ trial that we have Kim Kardashian today. So we will absolutely, what's bigger, the Scopes trial or Kim Kardashian? I mean, come on. Nothing's bigger than
Careful
Kim
where
Kardashian.
you go with that analogy.
I
It
know,
could have gone really sideways.
I know. But let's get back to the Scopes trial, though, okay? That clip that you showed with that news clip with all this framing of science versus religion, the fundamentalists versus liberals and intellectuals, that was really foreshadowing what would be the framing of this debate for the subsequent 100 years, that it is science versus religion. It's the enlightened, cool, chic scientists versus the narrow, bigoted, uninformed, uncool religious fundamentalists. And, Philip Johnson, one of the founders of the ID movement, used to say that when you read news stories, we used to say this at the Discovery Institute, they would just use the Control-Alt-Scopes framing of this issue, where they would just basically over and over again try to frame this as if it's, cool, enlightened, smart scientists versus the bigoted, uninformed, backwater religious fundamentalists. And that is the foreshadowing. That clip you showed is foreshadowing the framing we've seen for the subsequent 100 years. We can talk about the implications of that. And as Rick kind of alluded to also, a big other important part of the Scopes trial, and this is more, I think, getting the substance of what it was actually about, was do local people have the right and the ability to control what their children are learning? And that, I think, was what got, and Rick, you can correct me if this is wrong, but I think that was an issue that William Jennings Bryan was very passionate about, was the right of parents and local people to actually have a say in what their own children are learning in the classroom, rather than it being dictated by the quote unquote liberals and intellectuals from New York, like H.L. Mencken. Are they going to decide what kids in Tennessee learn, or are the parents of those children in Tennessee going to have the right? And, look, and I do want to say this too, we need to just get this off the table. What the Tennessee legislature did as far as making it a crime to teach a scientific theory about human evolution, that is absolutely the worst way to approach this topic. Like, I have nothing to say in praise of what the Tennessee legislature did as far as making it a crime. John T. Scopes should never have been put on trial for teaching human evolution. I think that that's a terrible way to deal with this issue. It should never be criminalized to teach a scientific theory. Even if you disagree with that theory, we should be giving teachers academic freedom. And this then gets to the reframing of this issue. We can get into this later, the whole line of cases that happened later. It's no longer about banning evolution. It's about, can you even question evolution? That's where we're at today.
Yeah. So one last thing in the framing of this, the ACLU. The ACLU obviously played a part in this. The question is, what part? Here's the framing that, again, we'll go back to Swamidas in this one with his interview with William Lane Craig and see what he has to say.
And this trial is about actually something called the Butler Act in Tennessee. It's held in Dayton, which is a small town there. And it's about whether or not evolution can be taught in a public high school. And there's a Tennessee law that Brian had been a part of that tried to outlaw it. But John T. Scopes was a test case of a teacher who claimed to have actually taught evolution and violating the act. And he was a test case that the nascent ACLU, this ends up being the very first case that the ACLU wins, the American Civil Liberties Union. They didn't win it initially, I should say. They won it on appeal, but this ends up becoming their most high-profile first case, really. to defend Scopes, and they asked Darrow to actually defend it. So there ends up being this epic clash between these two ideas, like kind of these Christians that are opposed to teaching evolution with this high public profile, clashing with this anti-Christian agnostic atheist saying that we're allowed to teach it.
Okay, Casey, I'm going to come to you on this one because this is a more of a law question. Although, Rick, you might have, if you looked at the history of this too, I don't know. But Casey, I'll come to you first. What do you think about that framing and the role of the ACLU and the significance of this case?
Basically, Swami Das calls the Scopes trial the first win for the ACLU. And he qualifies it, and he says they didn't win it initially, but they won an appeal. I think that is a real misunderstanding of what the ACLU's goal was in this case. First of all, the ACLU's first big win was in an earlier case called Gitlow versus New York, where basically this anarchist had been distributing, documents and pamphlets in New York advocating the violent overthrow of the government. And the ACLU brought a free speech case. And that was actually the first time, contra Swamidas, that the Supreme Court ruled that you could apply the First Amendment against the states. So that application did not happen later. But the Supreme Court, or actually the ACLU, calls the Gitlow case its first, quote, quote, significant victory. So the Scopes trial was not the first big win for the ACLU. And you have to understand what the ACLU's goals were in the Scopes trial. They wanted Scopes to lose at the lower level. Okay, they wanted him to lose so they could go on appeal, maybe even go to the U.S. Supreme Court and have the Butler Act overturned as being unconstitutional. Okay, that was their goal in the case, and that didn't happen. Of course, Scopes did lose at the trial court level, but then at the appellate level in Tennessee, the trial court conviction of Scopes was overturned on a technicality. And that meant that the ACLU cannot appeal the case to a higher level to try to overturn the Butler Act. And in fact, when the case was overturned on the technicality, the Tennessee Supreme Court basically said, look, you can retry this if you want, but you probably don't want to do that. In fact, Scopes was not even a teacher any longer at the time that the case was overturned. So it would have made no sense for the Tennessee Attorney General to go back and try to prosecute Scopes when he was not even a teacher anymore. So the ACLU's goal in the Scopes trial to have the Butler Act overturned was not actually accomplished. Now, you could argue that they won on a cultural level through this framing of science versus religion and the backwards fundamentalists being defeated. That's another debate we could have. But as far as the ACLU accomplishing their legal goals, their goal was not to get Scopes off on a technicality. Their goal was to have the Butler Act overturned. They did not accomplish that goal. And so I don't think that the ACLU calls the Scopes case a win for them. It certainly was not their first win. That would have been Gitlow versus New York, an earlier case. Actually decided just about a month before the Scopes trial started.
Rick, any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would just add that it was probably a cultural win, as you mentioned, and a publicity win, but it was not a legal win. The Butler Act was eventually overturned legally by the legislature in Tennessee, but it was like 40 yees later or something. It was in effect, but ignored basically. So in effect, they did win because the issue of evolution being taught, human evolution being taught, was never enforced after the Scopes trial. So they again sort of won a cultural win, but not a legal win, as Casey said.
Yeah. No, that's important. Let's jump forward a little bit and look at the actual textbook itself that was under consideration. Now, this is actually the classroom book used. It was George W. Hunter's 1914 textbook, Civic Biology, which did teach evolution, but it also taught eugenics and racial hierarchies, which were commonly advocated in this time based on the application of Darwin's theory of animal to human evolution. And I came across this first. I never even knew about this textbook until I started doing my PhD work as well, because I was focused on this issue of race, racism, racial hierarchies, those sort of issues that had come up, and was really surprised by the content of this and found it interesting. So this is there's a section that I want to read here, just so people understand what was in it. It wasn't just, oh, humans evolved from lower hominids type things. This is also what it was teaching as well. There's a section titled Parasitism and the Cost to Society. This is what Hunter writes. Hundreds of families, such as those described above, exist today. We're talking about people that are poor, mentally ill, diseased, all those sorts of things. It says they exist today, spreading disease, immorality, and crime to all parts of the country. The cost to society of such families is very severe. Just as certain animals or plants become parasitic to other plants or animals, these families have become parasitic on society. They not only do harm to others by corrupting, stealing, and spreading disease, but they are actually protected and cared for by the state out of public money. Largely for them, the poorhouse and the asylum exist. They take from society, but they give nothing in return. They are true parasites. Now, Scopes used this textbook to teach his students that the solution to these parasitic people was eugenics, specifically what would be a negative eugenics, or what the Germans would have called racial hygiene. Here's again what the textbook says. If such people were lower animals, we could probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow
Wow.
this, but we do have the remedy, the separating the sexes in asylums and other places, and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibility of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race, meaning the race of humanity, not necessarily white, black in this context, but although that was a part of it. But just to clarify that word race in this context, it means the human race. That the remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe, where we all know, and are now meeting with success in this country. So, Casey, when we look at this Butler Act specifically, now that was the textbook, but when we look at the Butler Act and what was actually at issue in this lawsuit, in this legal case, was it just evolution in general? Was it specifically only human to animal evolution? Or was the issue of eugenics and human hierarchies or racial hierarchies, was that at all a concern? What was the framing for this?
Yeah, so the issue in the Butler Act was basically human evolution, the idea that humans evolved from lower animals and the concern that that contradicted the biblical view of creation. That was the issue in the Butler Act. They weren't actually concerned with evolution generally, and they weren't concerned with eugenics or any of those kinds of ideas. Now, obviously, it's pretty pernicious that when Scopes goes and teaches evolution, actually it's a question mark whether he ever did teach evolution, but the textbook that he used, it was promoting these just pernicious ideas about the scum of the poor and racism, and these were ideas that were wrapped up in evolutionary ideology at that day. This textbook, which actually I've got a copy of that textbook in my office in downtown Seattle here at Discovery Institute, and it's there. You can read it, and it's like, oh my gosh, like these were some pretty terrible and horrific ideas that were wrapped up with evolutionary education at that time. No wonder maybe the folks in Butler, Tennessee were concerned about these ideas being taught to their kids. But the idea that they really were concerned about in the Butler Act was human evolution.
Rick, what's some context there? I know this crosses over to some of the stuff you wrote about for sure.
Hunter's civic biology, it's interesting. I was reviewing it the other day just because I knew we were going to talk about it. It has some pretty good biology, but then it has all of these incredible leaps of illogic into the eugenics justification and so on. And when it's talking about races in that passage you mentioned, it's really talking about the lower versions of humanity that need to be wiped out. And so the justification really is just atrocious. I mean, any public school today that tried to teach this would be completely out of line and would be, would be slapped down very quickly, just as they should have been then. So the issue was really this textbook and what it was teaching about eugenics and the way that we want to try and manipulate the human population in a way that is totally antithetical to any moral framework that we could imagine today. And it was the same justification that the Nazis were using later, just 15 years later, as they entered into World War II in the mid 30s, 10 years later. So it was the same justification the Nazis used and had used in World War I already. So
Yeah.
culturally, it was a real problem.
Yeah. And this is worth mentioning, and I don't want to get too sidetracked on the eugenics side because it wasn't a part of this case. So I don't want to go too deeply into that. But I do feel like we have to bring up something about this because the word does come into play. It is a part of even the history of these lawyers, at least how it gets written about, and even Christians. Hey, Brace, there used to be contests, sermon writing contests on eugenics. Who could write the best eugenics sermon? Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a Roman Catholic priest, argued, just like that textbook said, that it is not love, it is not biblical love to give to help the poor or the indigent, because we are allowing them to breed and that corrupts the human race, and we can't evolve to the higher evolutionary state of oneness with God as we're designed to if we allow these people to corrupt us from attaining our full humanhood. So these ideas were pernicious, but it kind of came up again. This is a Swamidass thing. It show seems like it's about Swamidass, but it really isn't. But it was just because Christians care about this issue. This is why these clips come up. But he really had this really interesting claim that he made about Brian being an advocate of eugenics. And I want to share this because I want to at least give people a framework to look further into this, even though we can't dive too deeply into this. So here's the way that it gets framed by Swamidass.
And of course, the Nazis kind of took that and they have their whole eugenic experiment that they're doing. But at the same time, William Jennings Bryan and his wife were arguing for eugenics in the United States. But they meant it in a different way than the Nazis. For them, it was kind of more about how do we actually kind of think about how to be a bit more thoughtful and informed in how we think about, reproduction in our context, not necessarily sterilizing people and everything that was going on. They weren't talking about an Uber race.
Yeah, so they weren't doing the Uber race thing. Maybe all I'll say about this, and if you guys want to add a thought, I'll link in the show notes. I've done several shows on this with Richard Weikart, who has his expertise in Hitler's ideology and how Darwin gets applied, Darwinian thought and eugenics gets applied in that context. I've done whole shows on eugenics as well. I bristle a little bit at this idea that, as Swamidass frames it, that Brian was a eugenist, because there were different kinds. And even one of the articles that I'll link to an article, it's republished, it's an academic peer-reviewed article republished by Cambridge University Press that talks about how he associated with people who were connected with the eugenics movement, but they were involved in the temperance movement. They did believe that when people drank alcohol, it had impact on the children that were born. In some sense, and I can't prove this at all, but almost more of a Lamarckian than a Darwinian framing of that, where our actions could impact the next generation. Again, that's just more speculation, something to think about, something maybe people want to explore this. But even at best case, he would have been an advocate of what was called positive eugenics, which is sort of just saying, hey, be cautious about the people you marry because you don't want to pass on disease or sickness. That's far different than the racialized and the deterministic human hierarchies created by social Darwinism and the negative eugenics, where they were forcibly sterilizing people, and they were advocating not helping people and with social programs, and telling churches were evil in this sense for helping the sick and the poor from that framework. That would not have, to my knowledge, have been a part of his. So technically, could he have been a eugenist in the sense that he believed that the way the people we choose to marry has an impact? That seems like a pretty loose connection to me. So I'm just not a fan of that, but I think it's worth exploring. Anything to add from either of you guys on that? I know it's a little bit of a side note, but I do think it's worth, because of the thorniness of that eugenic concept.
I would just say that I've been reading about Brian for a couple of years pretty intensively. I've never come across anything in his speeches or in his memoirs where he even mentions eugenics. So to infer what his beliefs are and be real clear about that seems a bit of a stretch, but it certainly would be out of character with him for him to have been in favor of the negative eugenics. You mentioned positive eugenics simply seems like choosing your spouse to be to one with whom you are compatible, and
Yeah.
so I don't think that that's a real easy case to make for Brian to be called a eugenicist. One of his key biographers, Michael Kazin, says he was definitely opposed to eugenics.
Yeah, it seems like a little bit of superficial reading of the history without the necessary understanding what the concepts really were. That's at least my initial take. But again, I'll link to some stuff in the show notes, and people can kind of read on that if they like. Let's move on to the movie though, really quickly here, and because there's the textbook, now we get the cultural framing. This is the piece where we want to move forward with. We have the understanding of the case, we have the issues that were at stake, but the cultural framing is really where the rubber meets the road. This is what's happening for us today. And we'll get into how the movie then shapes a lot of legal cases that we'll cover in just a little bit. So Inherit the Wind is the movie that is the most popular version of this case from 1960. Was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, framed itself as a battle between religion and science. The science, I want to show some scenes. Actually, there's a bit of an extensive clips. I'd never seen the movie, but I watched the whole movie and I clipped a bunch of things. So this goes on for a few minutes, about 4 minutes, but I clipped some of the scenes that I thought were really interesting, whether the cinematography or just how they depicted people or the dialogue. So Gene Kelly plays the reporter loosely based on H.L. Mencken. He's eating an apple in one scene. Sets the stage at the beginning when he comes into it. He's eating the apple and he's talking about this case of religion and the Bible. Of course, the Garden of Eden, right? He's in a turn of cinematographic elements, he's the devil coming into the garden, so to speak. It's really brilliant in that sense. And the poor teacher will be thrown to the lions, he says. So again, this turning of church history on its head. Cinematography again is amazing. I think the downlighting is often interesting early on because it's hot and it's in the South, but they use the downlighting on the religious people to show them really sweaty and kind of gross. And everybody's a little sweaty, but they don't use the downlighting on the advocates of evolution in the same way to make them make them sort of more heroic in the sense, not like the sweaty zealots of the fundamentalists.
You mean the enlightened people? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think it's really, in a sense, it probably did deserve some Academy Awards for the way it told the story, even if it was a false story. They did it well. So here's some clips for those who've never seen it, worth kind of watching.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Stanley Kramer. Nowadays, a motion picture producer engages in a great variety and types of battle. I've been in one or two myself. But I think that in my own career, nothing can possibly rival the excitement and the provocation of the battle which I have recently finished refereeing, in a manner of speaking. I refer to the battle and the clash in a motion picture film known as Inherit the Wind.
Ladies and gentlemen, devolution is not a theory, but a proven fact. My friends, man did not evolve from the ape, but the ape devolved from man. These are the wages of sin, my friends. You take a lesson, look and beware. I thank you. Your contributions will be gratefully received.
Grandpa. Welcome to Hillsborough, sir. Have you come to testify for the prosecution or the defense?
Colonel Drummond, can't you understand that if you take a law like evolution and you make it a crime to teach it in the public schools, tomorrow you can make it a crime to teach it in the private schools, and tomorrow you may make it a crime to read about it, and soon you may ban books and newspapers. And then you may turn Catholic against Protestant, and Protestant against Protestant, and try to foist your own religion upon the mind of man. If you can do one, you can do the other, because fanaticism and ignorance is forever busy and needs feeding. And soon, Your Honor, with banners flying and with drums beating, we'll be marching backward, through the glorious ages of that 16th century, when bigots burned the man who dared bring enlightenment and intelligence to the human mind.
His book. That was Proverbs, wasn't it?
He that troubleth his own house shall inherit the wind, and the fool shall be servant to the wise and heart.
Wow. Well, Colonel Drummond, we're growing an odd crop of agnostics this year.
You know, Hornbeck, I'm getting damn sick of you.
Why?
You never pushed a noun against a verb except to blow up something.
You know, that's a typical lawyer's trick. Accusing the accuser.
What am I accused of?
Contempt of conscience. Sentimentality in the first degree.
Why? Because I refuse to erase a man's lifetime?
No, because you know what I thought of him, and I know what you thought so. Let's leave the lamentations to the illiterate. What is this? Be kind to bigots week? Why should we weep for him? Because he's dead? No. Besides, he cried enough for himself during his lifetime. The national tear duct from Weeping Water, Nebraska. Oh, he flooded the nation like a one-man Mississippi. You know what he was, that Bible-beating bunco artist.
I succeed the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath were stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on.
All right, there it is. Again, if you're listening to the podcast version later on, you can always come to the website at morethancake.org. I'll have the video posted there as well, so you can see just how some of these scenes I'll play. I really do think it's a fabulous visual that creates a story. The problem is, Rick, let me turn to you. How much of that story, the perception of faith and science, is really true? How did this movie distort the reality of not just the trial, but the reality of what was being argued?
Well, here's where we have to go back into the context of the history of the day. Less than 50 years earlier, there was a huge popular history text that advocated for this idea of the history of the warfare between Christianity and science by A.D. White. And that was the prevailing idea at the time, is that science was opposed to religion, at least in the secular and university circles. That was really not the case, as Casey's pointed out in many places, in reality. But that was the thinking at the time in 1925. But the other things that were portrayed, I mean, there's the religious people, the way they're portrayed is parodied. The cross burning, all that never happened that I've found anywhere in the context of the trial. And so there's a preacher who's a key figure in the movie and the play who simply never existed. They made him up out of whole cloth. It's interesting. They claim in the introduction to the play and later the movie that it was not about real events, but it could be any time, any place. And here's the big danger. It was really supposed to be a warning about McCarthyism. And of course, that was going on at the time of the play, and then later the movie. Looking back 5 years, there was a 5-year separation between the movie on Broadway and the play on Broadway and the movie coming out, which is what you had the clips from. So it was in the context of McCarthyism, and they were worried about being silenced and this danger of people being silenced because of political pressure. That context is completely lost on modern audiences. They have no idea that that's what this is about. And so when you have Matthew Harrison Brady being the character that's representing William Jennings Bryan, I mean, even the pacing of the name is similar. Henry Drummond and Clarence Darrow, Scopes and Cates. So the way that they tried to make it align with the real story of the Scopes trial and the characters' names and so on is clearly not an accident. So it was, but unfortunately, that's the lingering memory that many people have of the trial is made based on the play or the movie. I mean, we did the play in high school when I was in high school, and that was in the late 60s. I'm a little older than you guys. But
Did
it
you
was
play like the
that
little
was
monkey, the
what I
organ
thought the
grinder
Scopes trial
monkey, or?
was. No, I wasn't into drum. My brother actually played, the Brady
Braid.
character,
Oh, okay.
the Bryant lookalike character. So
Huh.
so I was familiar with it from high school days, and thought that's what the trial was all about, and that's wrong.
Yeah, this is such an interesting take. Casey, I've got a question for you. I'm actually going to show you another clip, and I want to get your take on the same thing, but I'll show you a separate little clip that comes from this dialogue, because this is really all in your wheelhouse here. One point I want to mention, though, before I do that, that line at the end where Gene Kelly is delivering, is the reporter talking about, like, why should we weep for them? And he died. When I saw that, I could not help but think of the current political landscape, where we have our political enemies, and when we see harm done to them, we see celebration. Even like the Charlie Kirk thing or whatever it is, like, why should I weep for that person? That person is an evil person. Why should I have any compassion on those things? And that was the whole eugenic side of things. We shouldn't have compassion on those who are lesser than us. We shouldn't have compassion on those who harm us, those who bring fake news today or whatever it is. The entire worldview that it advocates on that side of things, and this is the view they're putting out for themselves, is a world that is devoid of compassion. And that really struck me about this movie, how it was celebrating that almost through that character. Yeah, they provide a balance to that, at the last scene there as well. But boy, that it's just really struck me. So anyway, Casey, here's my question for you. So I want to look at this. There's a movie, there's a channel that does called Did Inherit the Wind. It's called Retro Movie Roundtable, and in this, they all love the movie. They believe it's a timeless classic. They're the panelists are all interesting. They all agree there's no conflict between faith and science, but you'll hear what the way they define those things, which is where I want to get your thoughts in. But so look at how they define these terms, and and I inserted a clip of the two lawyers discussing this stuff on the porch. That wasn't in their original review, but I inserted what they were talking about so you could kind of get a sense of, here's what they're saying, here's what happened in the movie, and then this is where I want to get your take on, Casey.
What I want to discuss first and foremost is this idea of science and religion, because according to Brady and in his ideals, science and religion cannot coexist.
There used to be a mutuality of understanding and admiration between us, Henry. Why is it, my old friend, that you've moved so far away from me?
No, all motion is relative, Matt. Maybe it's you who have moved away by standing still.
If progress means abandoning God, abandoning the faith of our fathers.
I saw a demonstration of that faith tonight. It's a pretty deadly instrument, I'd say.
What you saw was a reflection of the violence and hate in the world around them, Henry. Your world. But they're driven to it because their faith was challenged. These are simple people, Henry, poor people. They work hard and they need to believe in something beautiful. They're seeking for something more perfect than what they have.
Window shopping for heaven.
And why do you want to take it away from them, Henry? It's all they have. Like a golden chalice of hope.
Like my golden dancer.
And I want to hear what you guys think. John, do you think that there is a place in which science and religion can live together in harmony?
I have never seen the conflict myself. I'm a retired professional archaeologist, so I'm sort of a scientist. Religion is about faith. It's about belief without evidence, and science is about belief with evidence. But it doesn't, just because one thing is true doesn't knock out the other thing. And so I never really understood the struggle.
Well said.
Yeah, there's nothing in particular saying that a miracle can't be explained by observation later. I really put a lot of respect on what you said about faith being belief without evidence. It's because we cannot prove it that it is faith at all.
So, Casey,
Wow.
as a almost scientist, for folks, the guy said he's the same degree history as our Casey, so I'm picking on him a little bit. So, what do you think? How does that frame the science and faith debate in your view?
Yeah, I mean, this is like the classic sort of non-overlapping magisteria view that people take today to try to resolve the science versus religion debate. They will put religion in the realm of, feelings and subjectivity, no evidence. These are simple people. They work hard and need something beautiful to believe in. They don't actually have any evidence. And then science is at the realm of evidence and objectivity and truth, actually, what we can actually see and verify with our eyes. And so if that's your way of resolving the conflict, quote unquote, between science and religion, basically what it means is that religion says nothing of any substance and it just bows before anything that science ever said. And so, obviously, I don't think that the Brian character Brady here is saying that science and religion can't coexist, contrary to the way this was set up. Really what I think that the true Brian would say that, science properly understood doesn't conflict with religion. And you have to look at the evidence. And that's certainly what I think many folks in the intelligent design camp would say today. It's not a situation where science and religion are in hermetically sealed boxes that never overlap. They do overlap. How can you possibly say that science and religion never speak to the same subjects? Okay, that's just, look at what they say. They do. They talk about the origin of humanity. They talk about, where things came from, how old things are in some cases, blah, blah, blah. So certainly they overlap. But the question is not, do they necessarily conflict? I would say that what we actually see when you look at the scientific evidence is that you find all this evidence in nature for an intelligent designer, for a creator being responsible behind life in the universe. So we find incredible amounts of agreement between science and religion when you look at the evidence objectively, and you don't take this false view where you're trying to basically protect religion by claiming that, science and religion never overlap. They never speak to the same subject. And I don't think that convinces very many people, by the way. So what you're seeing in that little clip that you showed, and I had a little difficulty hearing it, is I think this very simplistic, naive way of resolving the debate that really doesn't work for the vast majority of people out there.
Yeah. I love the story he tells in that about his golden dancer, that this object he sees in the window he just wanted forever, and he saved and he worked and he scraped to get this thing, and he buys it, and then it broke the first day. And that was the comparison to the story of creation, to the Bible. That's what he's saying. You're trying to give them their golden dancer, the thing that looks so shiny and beautiful until it faces reality, and then it's meaningless. And when these people on this movie review say, well, I don't see any conflict between science and faith. Faith is just that stuff that you see out there. It looks beautiful, but you can't really test it. I mean, there's no test for it. It's not falsifiable because it's not connected to what's real. Science is what's real. So of course there's no conflict. I just thought that again is how it shaped the culture. Again, and as you point out, Rick, too, that had been around since Draper White in the 1800s, and the whole conflict motif. So that's really interesting how that shapes out. Now, Casey, since we're on you, let's shift with that movie in mind. How does this shape the legal landscape? That's what I really want us to take a look at now, because we're going to lead on you now for a little bit here. Rick, you can always jump in, but I know this is Casey's wheelhouse, so I imagine he's got more to say than either of us.
You got it, Casey. I do have to defend Casey, though. His degree, his PhD, is not in archaeology. The half science that the guy was talking. He's a geologist, so that's a real scientist.
Oh, that's true. Yes, yeah. He's not a half scientist. He's a real scientist. So, although some people say
but
geology
go on the legal
is
stuff, Casey.
I mean, I'm not here to bash archaeologists. I think that they're plenty scientists. I have no problem with archaeologists. But we can talk about the legal landscape in terms of how the actual Scopes trial set up the legal landscape, and also in terms of how this film, Inherit the Wind, has affected the legal landscape. And since that clip was Inherit the Wind, let's do that first.
Yeah, do the first one on the movie.
Yeah. So, I mean, the late Supreme Court Justice Scalia called the Inherit the Wind movie, quote, promoting the beloved secular legend of the monkey trial. And the former UC Berkeley law professor, Philip Johnson, who is sort of the godfather of the ID movement, he called it the Inherit the Wind stereotype. what are we talking about here? We're talking about this stereotype that you see in all these clips that's not very subtle. I mean, it's pretty much like blaring in your face that religious
You
people
think?
and
Yeah.
Darwin skeptics in particular are ignorant, backwards, bigoted, and dangerous, frankly, to the plurality and freedom that we have in America. Okay. Like literally challenging Darwin is a threat to freedom and intellectual freedom and free speech and the ability to actually do science. And they are not just, dangerous to freedom, but they're not cool people. Like they're dumb, they're stupid, they're simple, they're backwards. They're nobody that you want to be friends with. Okay. So, and in fact, this has been recognized by even some critics of intelligent design. Eugenie Scott, who's the famous, former executive director of the National Center for Science Education, even she says that in Inherit the Wind, quote, anti-evolutionists and fundamentalists in general were portrayed as foolish, unthinking religious zealots. And of course, in contrast, the evolutionists are cast as the enlightened, winsome, progressive, freedom-loving science and educators. So what this movie did is it's been shown in countless high school and college classrooms all around the United States. And so what students receive from this movie is basically stereotypes about Darwin skeptics and evolutionists, where Darwin skeptics are these dangerous bad people and evolutionists are these wonderful good people. And so you have these stereotypes being promoted through this film. So if we talk about, how does bigotry and how does prejudice lead to problems in society? Okay. I learned about, basically racial discrimination when I was in college. We studied this at UC San Diego, and it starts with stereotypes. Stereotypes then lead to prejudice against individuals belonging to certain groups. And over time, that prejudice begins to lead to outright discrimination, which is often manifested as actions that are taken to marginalize those individuals belonging to those disfavored groups. This is how prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes work across the board, whether you're talking about, prejudice against women or racial minorities or other groups. Okay. So today we have like this huge number of ID-friendly scientists and Darwin skeptics that have been persecuted in the academy. And you want to ask the question, where did that persecution come from? How did it start? Well, it started with stereotypes, which led to prejudice, which led to outright acts of discrimination. And if you want to, look for sort of what is the super spreader of stereotypes and prejudice against Darwin skeptics, you're looking at it right there. It's the film Inherit the Wind that's been shown in countless high school and college classrooms around the country, promoting these false stereotypes that Darwin skeptics are these dangerous people that need to be suppressed. Okay. We're actually praising, and that earlier clip you showed, the idea that these are bad people who need to be knocked down in society. Okay. So it's not hard to figure out why there is so much persecution of pro-ID scientists in the academy, why there's so much prejudice. It comes from the Inherit the Wind stereotype that's been promulgated throughout society and is widely believed. Okay. So that's one important, I think, after effect of the Scopes trial right there. It has led to a huge amount of prejudice and stereotypes against Darwin skeptics in the academy. But what about the actual Scopes trial? Well, the ACLU's goal in the Scopes trial was to actually overturn the Butler Act and then establish a legal landscape where the teaching of evolution was solidified and secured. And they actually did ultimately accomplish that in 1968 in the case Epperson versus Arkansas. The U.S. Supreme Court overturned this act in the state of Arkansas that had made it basically illegal to teach evolution. And essentially what the court did is not only in that case did they say that it is legal to teach evolution. That was a good thing. I mean, I don't think, again, we should be banning scientific theories. And so that needed to happen. But what the court did in the Epperson versus Arkansas case is they effectively made it illegal to not teach evolution, where if you don't teach evolution, you're going to be viewed with extreme suspicion as having been animated by a religious motive. And they actually put the motives of the legislature on the table. And they said that if you are not teaching evolution, that is essentially illegal. Now, I personally do think that schools should teach evolution. Even if you don't agree with it, students need to understand and learn about evolution. It's a very influential scientific theory, and it's important that students learn about evolution. However, when you're actually making it illegal to not teach evolution, and you're dictating what schools have to teach. Now I think you're getting into what William Jennings Bryan concern was in taking the Scopes case to begin with. Do you still have local control of what students can learn, and do parents and local leaders have the ability to say what they will learn? And then the Epperson case in 1968 was just the beginning of a long line of cases, which ultimately ended up banning the teaching of non-evolutionary views. You had cases in the 1970s, 1980s, that basically said that it is illegal to teach creationism. And that culminated in the 1987 U.S. Supreme Court case, Edward versus Aguilar, where actually the U.S. Supreme Court said that it is illegal to teach creationism in public schools. Now, in that case, in the Edwards case, there is a silver lining. There actually was a statement where the U.S. Supreme Court said that they did not say that you cannot bring in scientific critiques of prevailing scientific theories. And so this, I think, opened the door for being able to critique evolution in public schools. And so we actually do have a number of states around the country now today that either require or permit schools to teach scientific criticisms of evolution, basically to teach the scientific strengths and the scientific weaknesses of evolution. This is a very good approach to teaching evolution, but the reality is that the vast majority of schools today in the United States have what I call the one-sided teaching of evolution. And this has to do with this line of cases that started with Epperson, where you only teach the pro-evolution evidence and any other evidence is really censored from students. And for me, I think this is incredibly unjust. I think that students should not have, they should have full access to all of the scientific evidence. We should not be censoring from students scientific evidence that challenges evolution. But, we do see this line of cases that has led in many cases today, many places today in the United States, to the one-sided teaching of evolution. And that is a very bad thing.
Yeah, that's great. So let me ask you this real quick question, because there's a good survey of things. Just for the historical framework side of it, last clip from Swamidas on Craig, when it was on Craig's show, he had written this article about it. He talked about the case law, the significance historically about this too. And I have no idea what the answer is to this, but I'm curious to your take. Here's the claim he talks about. It's the first case for how the First Amendment applied to the states. That was his sort of claim. So here's how he frames it.
But the other reason why it even happened is that it wasn't really yet established in jurisprudence that the First Amendment protections actually constrain the states yet. So this was a state law. It wasn't a federal law, and it didn't actually get in front of the Supreme Court. And that actually gets developed later. So it's only, I think it's in I forget if it's 65 or 64, that it becomes very clear that because it was motivated to protect a religious belief, it's unconstitutional, even if it's done by just merely a state government. In contrast, the argument that was being made at that time is that it wasn't teaching a religious view. It was just telling them that they couldn't teach another view. So that you couldn't teach. So that's something a state was allowed.
All right, Casey, clear that up for me, a non-expert.
Yeah, I mean, we can forgive Swami Das here. He's not a legal scholar and attorney, but he gets a lot of facts wrong about the case law here. So first of all, the first case to actually apply the First Amendment to the states. Think of the First Amendment when it was written in the Constitution is only applied to Congress and the federal government, okay? But after the 14th, 15th Amendments, you start to have that are passed in the 1800s, you start to have this line of cases that explicitly applies the First Amendment and some of the other amendments to the Constitution to the states. And so the first time that happened, that the First Amendment was applied to the states, was actually in that case we mentioned earlier, Gitlow versus New York, which was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in June of 1925, about a month before the Scopes trial. So it's not the case that the First Amendment was not applied to the states at the time of the Scopes trial. It already had been about a month before that. It's also not the case that the First Amendment was not applied to the Scopes to the states until the 1960s. Okay, he says 1964 or 1968 or something like that. Here, I think he's thinking about the Epperson versus Arkansas case, which is a case that did overturn the Butler Act and similar acts like that. But that was not a case that was like the first precedent to apply the First Amendment to the states. In fact, if you want to talk about the Establishment Clause, prohibiting the establishment of religion by the government, that was actually applied to the states in 1947 in the case Everson versus Board of Education. So, although his legal history here is muddled, he's not wrong to say that Scopes was ultimately overruled because of the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in the Epperson case in 1968. But he's getting some details wrong about when the First Amendment was applied to the states and those sorts of details.
Okay. Yeah, that's super helpful. Just to get the scope of the Scopes case, just get the full context historically and clarify those details, because they do matter, especially in something that we've seen as so culturally, legally, and socially divisive. And that leads us to our next session. I just want to get some policy and some takeaways, some advice from both of you on areas, especially when we're articulating a Christian view in the classroom, when we're dealing with this in education. What is some advice? First, let's stick with advice for teachers. So if we have advice for teachers, how should they approach this if they are a Christian in the classroom? I'll give you just a real quick story. For example, I was in California, in San Diego. I had a teacher of one of my sons at a middle school it was in a science class. He was actually showing a clip of Richard Dawkins that was mocking Christian views in the clip. Now, he didn't show the exact clip where the mockery took place. He showed the clip before it, but I went to the principal. I said, "Look, you can't do this. You can have people to talk about the science religion difference and that we need to teach this. You can find lots of great spokesmen and women for this, but why would you pick an anti-Christian guy that's going to point students to say this is the right view?" And the principal, who was not a Christian, definitely not that line of view. I won't say why, but definitely was not. I knew he was not. But he's like, you're right. So we had a meeting with this teacher, and this teacher, who actually was a Christian, didn't even understand who Dawkins was. But these ideas get so built into the culture, he didn't even know what he was advocating for. He just thought this is the way everybody should teach this. So I had the non-Christian principal actually saying, yeah, don't show a video like this, to the Christian teacher who was showing this video because he didn't understand the issues that were at stake. So all this to say, this is a pretty important issue. So teachers, I'll start with you, Casey, and then Rick, I'll let you come in after that. So what's the couple ideas of advice for teachers when they deal with these issues of intelligent design, creation, evolution in a science context, let's say?
Yeah, so it's a very complicated issue, and I definitely can't fault a teacher if they're not fully versed in the law. I've written a couple law review articles that actually try to give teachers advice on how to teach this issue. For me personally, Joe, I actually went to public schools from kindergarten through my master's degree. My high school was a very large public inner city high school in Long Beach, California. Snoop Dogg actually went to my high school. We had 4,400 students, a huge public school. I mean, it was larger than many, small towns. And I remember learning about evolution and actually watching a video when we were learning evolution that was explicitly, speaking against the Christian view. Okay. And so that certainly would be pushing the envelope of what you can or cannot say legally. So when I talk to teachers, and I've talked to numerous teachers and school board members and legislators over the year about how to approach this issue in public schools, here's what we tell them. It is legal to teach scientific criticisms of evolution. Now, you've got to keep the conversation on a scientific level. And so what we say is you should teach the scientific evidence for and against evolution. Evolution is a very influential theory. Students do need to learn about the evidence for evolution, especially when they go out to college. It's going to be part of their curriculum. They need to understand this, but they also need to understand that there are real scientific challenges to evolution, challenges that are grounded in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, challenging the ability of natural selection and random mutation to produce complex features, challenging the tree of life, challenging the idea that there are transitional forms in the fossil record. You can find all of these scientific problems with evolution being raised in the mainstream peer-reviewed scientific literature. So if mainstream scientists are allowed to talk about this, why can't public school teachers? And so we say that public school teachers, as long as they have the academic freedom to do this, they should teach the evidence for and against evolution. Now, we also say don't bring in religious views, okay? So don't bring in creationism. That has been found to be a religious view by the U.S. Supreme Court. That's going to get you into legal trouble. Don't bring in the Bible, the book of Genesis. Science classroom is where you should be teaching science. But the big question we get asked is, what about intelligent design? Now, at Discovery Institute, as you know, we are the biggest supporters of intelligent design as a scientific theory. Most of my time these days, Joe, is not spent talking to teachers. I'm also the research director. I remember I have a PhD in science. I'm also the research director at Discovery Institute. And I can tell you that we have a very vibrant and active scientific research program that is publishing many peer-reviewed papers finding scientific evidence for intelligent design. And so our priority with intelligent design is to see it grow and develop as a science. And this has been our view for many years. So what we have found is that when public schools bring ID into the curriculum, that tends to cause all kinds of political controversies, legal controversies that end up fanning those flames of intolerance that we talked about earlier that leads to persecution of pro-ID scientists in the academy, okay? So in the wake of the Dover trial, that was a 2005 case where a school district in Dover, Pennsylvania actually did require a very short statement to be read about intelligent design in the classroom. Now, what that school district did in Dover, Pennsylvania, we at Discovery Institute actually encouraged them to not adopt a policy that required intelligent design to be brought into the curriculum. Because we said, if you do this, this is going to lead to all kinds of legal controversy and lead to ultimately, more persecution of pro-ID scientists. And that was the advice that Discovery Institute gave to the Dover School Board. Unfortunately, they did not listen to Discovery Institute's advice. I was not working Discovery Institute yet at that time. I didn't join Discovery Institute until September of 2005, right as the Dover case went to trial, because the Dover School District got sued by the ACLU. And ultimately, the judge found that intelligent design was a religious view and not legal to teach in public schools. Now, I strongly disagree with that ruling. In fact, the 20th anniversary of the Dover ruling is coming up in December of 2025. Maybe we can talk about that in a couple months if you want, Joe. So we could spend a whole, podcast talking about all the errors that the judge made in that ruling, where he found that ID is creationism and religion and not legal to teach in public schools. But the bottom line is that case in the Dover ruling, for your question right now, what should teachers teach? That case was not appealed. It was only decided at the lowest level of the federal courts, at the district court level. So I would basically consider the teaching of intelligent design to be an unsettled legal question in the United States. There has never been an appellate court or much less a Supreme Court ruling on the teaching of intelligent design. It's really an unsettled legal question. But just because it's not, settled does not mean that we in the ID community think that it is smart for public schools to teach ID. And we would say that public schools should not bring ID into the curriculum because, again, it's going to lead to lawsuits. It's going to lead to all kinds of persecution of pro-ID scientists. This is what I was going to say earlier. In the wake of that Dover ruling, where the judge ruled ID was unconstitutional, we saw an intense spike in the amount of persecution of pro-ID scientists in the academy. And in some cases, they would actually cite the Dover ruling as justification for trying to hound ID proponents out of the academy. And what was interesting is, as the Dover ruling was getting started, Judge Jones, the judge in that case, actually said that he was going to rewatch Inherit the Wind for historical context. And it's like, oh my gosh, this inaccurate telling of the Scopes trial that leads to all this prejudice against Darwin skeptics. And the judge in that case is going to watch it for, historical context. Oh my goodness. This is actually another small factoid that Joshua Swamidass gets wrong. In his interview with Jim Tour, he says that it was one of the defense attorneys defending the school district who said he was going to go and reread the Scopes trial. No, it was the judge in the case who said he was going to rewatch Inherit the Wind as he prepared for the case. And oh my gosh, I mean, even leading legal scholars have said that the Inherit the Wind telling of the Scopes trial is inaccurate. I actually took a course from Edward Larson during law school, who wrote the book Summer for the Gods, the Pulitzer Prize winning book, where the main argument in that book, one of the main arguments, is that Inherit the Wind is an inaccurate retelling of the Scopes trial. So I want our listeners to know it's not just us ID people who are saying that the Inherit the Wind movie is very inaccurate. Anyway, back to the point. What should teachers teach? They should teach the evidence for and against evolution without getting into religious views like creationism, and also not bringing in scientific alternatives like intelligent design. Because if you do that, you're going to cause all kinds of legal controversy. And our priority in the ID movement is to see ID grow and develop as a science, not to turn it into a legal hot potato. We've never thought that this debate is going to be settled by courts. It shouldn't be settled by courts. It should be settled not by politics or legal issues, but by the science. And that's why at Discovery Institute, we are focusing so much on pouring, funds and money into supporting ID research and seeing ID published peer-reviewed papers showing the scientific evidence for intelligent design. So that is the advice that I give to teachers. Sometimes I will say, Joe, that I've actually done more to keep ID out of public schools than the NCSE and then Eugenie Scott, okay? Because, but I'm not doing it because I think ID is a bad idea. I'm doing it because I want to protect ID, not turn it into a political hot potato, and let it grow and develop as a science. Because we saw what happened at the Dover case. We saw an intense spike, again, of persecution in the wake of a school district that brought ID into the curriculum, and then, all this legal controversy that ensued. Now, all that being said, let's have a little reality check. What did the Dover School District do? All they did was adopt a short 4-paragraph statement that was to be read before one, class in biology, which said that there is this alternative to evolution called intelligent design. Here's what it is, and you can learn more about it with a book in the library if you want to learn more. That's all they did. And that massively triggered the ACLU so that they brought a lawsuit to ban intelligent design from public schools. This is why Justice Scalia said—
I mean, they were banning books? What? The left?
Yeah, where they're banning. It's
shocking.
No longer is it. This is why Justice Scalia said that we now live in an era of scopes in reverse. Okay, no longer is it the religious fundamentalists who are trying to ban ideas from public schools. It is literally the evolution lobby, the mainstream evolution proponents. They're the ones trying to get non-evolutionary views banned from public schools. They did it successfully with creationism, and they have tried to do it with intelligent design. They did successfully do that in the Dover case, but they are actually the ones today who are trying to ban non-evolutionary views and views that they disagree with from public schools, whereas it is the Darwin skeptics. We are the ones who are advocating for academic freedom. In fact, one of the main— I'll stop here in just a moment, but one of the main approaches that we promote at Discovery Institute when somebody comes to us and wants to know how to address this is we will say, try to pass an academic freedom law that it doesn't require teachers to do anything different in the classroom. But what it does is it protects their jobs if they want to bring in legitimate scientific critiques of ideas like evolution or the origin of life. They can do that without having to worry about getting fired. So you're protecting the academic freedom of teachers to teach good, objective science in the science classroom. And I think this is a wonderful solution to this issue. We've actually seen 3 or 4 states that have adopted academic freedom type laws or policies, and they're very good solutions to this issue. So again, Scopes trial, you had fundamentalists who were banning ideas they disagreed with. But fast forward now 100 years, we are now in the era of Scopes in reverse, where it's the evolutionists who are banning ideas that they disagree with, and it's the Darwin skeptics that are standing for academic freedom.
Yeah. Yeah, we see that happen societally all the time, where we go from here's the dominant position, we just want tolerance for our position. Then the position is tolerated, then it has to be, you have to actually celebrate or embrace it. And then once it's celebrated and embraced, then they go back, well, it's intolerance to even disagree with us, so let's ban the original position that we started with. It's just a human nature thing, that pendulum swings. And so we have to be very cautious of that. Rick, I know neither you or I are the legal guys here, but any advice in terms of articulating Christian worldview ideas or these concepts for teachers, students, parents, churches? What role can we play in this conversation of, as we're talking about creation evolution? What should we do? What advice would you have?
Well, I would certainly defer to Casey in terms of the legal advice. Let me just go back culturally and say something we haven't brought up. Casey talked about triggering the ACLU. The original Scopes trial was a triggering of the ACLU. They actually advertised for a test case, and that's what brought about the Dayton city leaders joining into this controversy in the first place, was to bring notoriety to this town that was kind of down economically, and they thought it would bring a bunch of publicity. It did, but not the kind they wanted. And so the ACLU has been involved from the get-go. So again, as far as advice, I would defer to Casey, but in terms of culture, I've lived a fair amount of it. So when I've done all my education in public universities and schools as well, I would say in high school and in college, it was fairly neutral. I had a world religions teacher who was openly Christian and said, I have to tell you when I'm talking about Islam that I'm teaching from a Christian perspective. You have to know my background so you understand my biases. That was open back then. It's not open now. When I was toward the end of my airline career professionally, I was going back to school to try and figure out what to do when I grow up in retirement and working on this PhD project. At that point, the humanities were openly hostile to things like intelligent design, openly hostile to any evidence for Christianity, whereas the science people were more silent. The biology people, they don't really care that much about evolution. They'll put it into their papers, they'll drop it in to be part of the club, but then they write about what really works, and they care about what is it that makes this cell react in a specific way so I can develop a treatment or a therapy or understand it better and learn. They don't care that much about evolution, but they'll drop it in and say, we are amazed at how this evolution thing developed this incredibly complex process. So the science people, they'll sort of do these one-liners, but they really are not hostile. The humanities people, they're the ones who think the science is settled, and they teach on that basis, and they silence opposition. It was kind of eye-opening. When we were teaching in the private school setting, I think our students, I was teaching earth science to junior high kids for a while, and I think our students knew more about evolution than the public school students because we did teach what the theory was, and we thought they needed to understand that, but we taught strengths and weaknesses. So I think there's great academic, intellectual value in doing that so that students do understand it, as Casey so well pointed out. And I think if one of the going back to one of the clips you mentioned that you played about the lack of evidence for Christianity, you tell that to people like Stephen Meyer and James Tour that we don't have evidence. So there's lots and lots of evidence on the side. In fact, I would say all the evidence is on our side at this point, scientifically, culturally, archaeologically, validating the Old Testament, everything from that. I just heard a lecture by Titus Kennedy, who's a PhD archaeologist, talking about all the evidence we have on the side of Christianity. So I think the evidence is on our side. I think the openness is far more prevalent on our side than the other side. We want kids to understand both sides. And I think it has been shown. I mean, many school districts are now teaching the Bible as literature to try and have people be less biblically illiterate. I mean, if you talk about the patience of Job to a modern high school student, they have absolutely no idea what that is. So we're losing the cultural literacy that used to be part of our standard upbringing. So on a lot of different levels, I think there are ways you can teach things that are aligned with and friendly toward religion. And again, I appreciate Casey's depth of knowledge on the legal precedents.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'd just say for takeaway for parents would be and students as well is you may not even be able to teach the science, but you can teach how science literacy in the sense of helping them understand the difference between a observational science claim, a historical claim, or a worldview claim, and how those get blended together to create a narrative, the story that's being told. And we can do this in a lot of ways outside of science, but that's one of the things I try to work with in my worldview classes with my students is to see that a lot of these claims, a lot of the things that are being said aren't really even science to begin with. Sometimes they are just perceptions of the world or their interpretation of things that are factual, but they're interpreting them a certain way through a certain lens. So parents can still teach their kids to discern the distinction between those things, to make sure they understand that so that when they're in the classroom, and if a teacher says something that goes over the line where they're degrading religion in some way, they have rights that they don't have to sit there and take that. They can go to the principal, they can go to authorities that are above them and say, hey, look, this teacher can teach evolution all they want, but they can't say, just like I can't bring in Genesis as an authority, they can't then ridicule that in the middle of a science class because that is also teaching a religious worldview perspective, even though it's an anti-religious worldview perspective. So I think knowing those rights, but also teaching at home how to discern those things, doing that in the church context or home context is super important. All right, well, hey, our time's getting up here. I think we covered a lot of territory, but I just want to come to each of you just for one last maybe takeaway, big idea, big thought. It can be from something we didn't get to cover, you thought we'd hope we'd cover, something you think people could do moving forward, an idea to focus on, or a resource that you think would be great. Whatever it is, just your final takeaway on this. I appreciate your time. But Casey, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I just want our listeners to be encouraged. I mean, it's very easy to get discouraged sometimes. You know, we live in this era of scopes and reversed where non-evolutionary views are being suppressed. That is true. But again, what matters most here is what is true, okay? And if you look at the scientific evidence for intelligent design, it is just going gangbusters. I mean, we've seen in my lifetime, we've seen the idea of junk DNA that was one of these strong arguments used against intelligent design. It's basically gone belly up. We've seen this incredible complexity of the cell, where the more we learn about the cell, the more we're realizing it's full of new layers of information, control, architecture. The cell functions like a computer or maybe even like a large language model. I mean, the complexity of the cell, the deeper we look, the more complex it gets. I love the way Jim Tour frames it, that the more every year our solution to the origin of life gets further and further away because we're learning more and more about the complexity and the information rich content of the cell. And then you talk about, just trends in science. We've seen in the last 15 or 20 years the growth of this movement called the third way evolution camp. These are basically mainstream evolutionary scientists who reject neo-Darwinism. And in many cases, they are using the same kind of arguments that were raised by proponents of intelligent design. The idea that the tree of life is falling apart, or the idea that there are these complex features that you can't build up one little mutational step at a time. We are seeing intelligent design arguments vindicated left and right in the scientific community. And meanwhile, what they said we could never do, that ID would never become a full-fledged research program. We're seeing that. That's happening. The ID has a very active research community, publishing peer-reviewed scientific papers. We're now over 300 peer-reviewed pro-intelligent design scientific papers that have been published. So it's a very exciting time to see where the evidence is leading and to see how intelligent design has been so successful in making good scientific predictions. So, at the end of the day, when you're hearing people on the internet discussing this topic, whoever it may be, Swami Das, the key question you need to ask is this person asking what is true? And are they displaying courage in pursuing the truth? And I think right now we are in a moment where people need to stand up and have courage and stand up and seek the truth and realizing that the truth is on our side. And that is the encouragement I would give to folks as a takeaway from this podcast today.
All right, all good stuff. Rick, what about you, brother?
Well, I'm a bit of a loss because most of the really good information I've been inspired by recently has been the Discovery Institute stuff, and Casey's already covered much of that. So I totally agree that the evidence for this whole science versus creation debate, not creationism, but who created, what is true, what does the evidence lead to, the inference to the best explanation is that there is an intelligent, powerful, creative entity that has to be responsible for things like programming. So anytime we see a computer program or something in literature, we know that it was written by an intelligent agent. The inference to the best explanation is that this intelligent agent is so powerful and creative, and we see that in what has been made, much as we read in Paul's narrative in Romans 1. And so the evidence is on our side. I'm encouraged that the new atheists of the early 2000s, 2005 to 2010, they were really active. They've really kind of gone silent. There is no new information coming out of the other side in terms of evidence for why evolution should be believed as true. And as Casey points out, we care about what's true. And so just be encouraged, as Casey said. I'm going to keep repeating what he said because he did such a great job. But no, I think the evidence is on our side. I think there's opportunity, really good literature, lots of people that are thinking deeply about these things, from Jordan Peterson to others that have not necessarily come across to the Christian side. But Ian Hershey Ali, for example, people that are looking at the evidence and saying there's more here than I thought, and I'm going to change my views, and that's an encouragement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I say one other thing, Joe?
Oh, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and also, Rick, thanks for what you just said. Very, very kind words. I appreciate that. But I think we also need to appreciate that this issue is not going to be settled by the courts. Okay. Courts, they change their composition. Rulings come and go. Maybe someday we'll have a Supreme Court ruling that says that intelligent design is in fact constitutional to teach. I have no idea. But at the end of the day, what we've always said is this issue is going to be decided by the science. So I love talking about the legal history. It's very important. It's very practical. But we need to also keep in mind, what is the right role to use the law and policy side of this debate? For me, it's never about strong arming people or forcing people to believe something. What it's about is giving people access to the evidence so they can make up their own minds. That's what gets me up in the morning. When I was a student, both in high school and college, the vast majority of my classes taught only the pro-evolution view, and they censored the evidence. What I believe, the role of the court should be expanding, and the role of our policy positions that we promote should be to expand student access to the evidence so they can make up their own minds. Because at the end of the day, only the evidence is going to decide this issue. And that's why in the ID camp, if you look at the policies that we promote, they are universally dedicated to expanding student access to evidence. And if you look at the policies that the evolution lobby promotes, they are almost universally committed to decreasing the amount of evidence that students have access to. Why is that? That's a question you need to ask. Why is it that the Darwin skeptics today are always trying to expand the amount of evidence students can learn about, and the evolution proponents are trying to retract that? I mean, heck, even Joshua Swamidass, we can go back to him one more time. He had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a couple years ago where he basically was arguing against academic freedom for young Earth creationist institutions. Now, I'm not a young Earth creationist, but I certainly think that they should have academic freedom to be able to promote their views. He said that they should be, tracked. And if they have deviations from the national norms in a science curriculum, they should be reported. Okay. So, he's basically standing against academic freedom of people to pursue what they think is true if it disagrees with his evolutionary view. And of course, Joshua has every right to have his evolutionary view. I would not ever want to take that academic freedom away from him. But why is it that it's the Darwin skeptics that always are standing for academic freedom today? And it's the evolution proponents who are trying to restrict academic freedom. I find that very interesting. Usually when people are confident that the evidence is on their side, they're not afraid to have a debate. They're not afraid to have people learn about views they disagree with. And I can tell you that the Darwin skeptics, we certainly are very comfortable having people learn about views we disagree with and having a debate and a conversation here. So again, the law should not be used to force people to do things they don't want to do, but it should be used to expand academic freedom. And that's the way I think the Discovery Institute, I'm very proud of our track record on this issue, promoting academic freedom in the classroom.
Yeah, that's all good. Well, my thought would be this, to add to all that, it's excellent, is that as somebody whose focus has been, in my PhD, was on biblical ethics, that science definitely needs a moral compass. And there's a role to be played, not like in the role of the video, like, and they talked about the movie where science is the facts and religion is just your false feelings based on nothing. But science needs a moral compass because it doesn't tell us what is right or wrong, it just tells us what it is. So even if science can tell us there's a biological quality to alcoholism or something like that, doesn't mean that person's life is worth less, except unless you have a worldview that says that person's life is worth less. And William Jennings Bryan, in his closing speech that was never actually delivered, has this great quote that I think is worth closing on for here. He says, "Science is a magnificent force, but it is not a teacher of morals. It can perfect machinery, but it adds no moral restraints to protect society from the misuse of the machine. It can also build gigantic intellectual ships, gigantic intellectual ships, but it constructs no moral rudders for the control of the storm-tossed human vessel. It not only fails to supply the spiritual elements needed, but some of its unproven hypotheses rob the ship of a compass and thus endangers its cargo," which means humanity in that case. "If civilization is to be saved from the wreckage threatened by intelligence not consecrated by love, it must be saved by the moral code of the meek and lowly Nazarene. His teachings alone can solve the problems that vex heart, and perplex the world. A bloody, brutal doctrine, evolution, demands, as the rabble did 1900 years ago, that he be crucified. That cannot be the answer. The jury, representing a Christian state and a sworn to uphold the laws of Tennessee. So that, I think, is a fabulous idea of needing that moral rudder, not just to guide science, but society and the minds that do it. Well, appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your time. I knew this was going to be a marathon as we started to put this together. And so thank you for hanging in there. I appreciate you very much. Thanks also to everyone for joining us on this live edition of the show. I want to encourage my brothers and sisters to go out and till the soil of culture so that you can raise the roof on the belief that the Bible is anti-science. I hope you'll come back and join me in the next episode. And in the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.